And we're back with Ask4TR, located at www.ask4tr.com. With us today is Michael O'Donnell with Sasquatch Mountain Tactical. Michael, tell us a little bit about your organization.
So I own a company called Sasquatch Mountain Tactical. I make custom holsters for firearms, typically for concealed carry holders or people who carry a firearm on a daily basis. I do make stuff that is more tactical for carrying openly and that kind of thing.
Do you happen to make any one particular holster more than others?
I typically focus more on the concealed carry aspect, so it would be what's called an inside the waistband holster, and that's carried between your body and your pants, and then your belt kind of holds it in place there.
Okay.
And so it's more concealable, it's more comfortable on a daily basis, it's an easier way to do it. So you don't have this big giant firearm in a holster outside of your pants hanging out and being exposed.
And being very, very visible.
Right.
So when you work with holsters like that, are you looking for as small of a firearm as possible when you're sculpting the mesh around it, or does it matter?
I do it for just about every size gun every size pistol there is available. Obviously, a smaller firearm is going to be a lot easier to conceal. I carry a full-size firearm on a fairly daily basis. I do have smaller guns as well, but I comfortably carry a full-size Glock 17 all the time, and it's not noticeable. It's not uncomfortable.
So now, do you have a website that people could go to take a look at the stuff that you've actually created?
My website would be sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead.
smtac.com.
It's S is in Sam,
S
M, or S is in Sasquatch, M is in Mountain.
And then TAC.
All right, .com.
.com.
All right. And how long have you been in business?
About 2.5 years now.
All right. So, Michael, there is a distinction between the AR-15 and a regular hunting rifle, or just a non-AR-15 rifle. Is that fair to say?
It's somewhat fair to say.
So now, what is the distinction between an AR-15 and just a regular hunting rifle?
Well, there's a lot of similarities between what most people would consider a hunting rifle and the AR-15, and then there are some differences. The AR-15 is a semi-automatic rifle. A lot of people frequently refer to it as a sporting rifle because it's often used for things like competitive shooting, also hunting and things like that. So it is still a hunting rifle. It does take a detachable box magazine like these on the table here. They typically have a pistol-style grip in the rear near the trigger, and then usually a muzzle device on the end called a flash hider that diverts the hot gas coming out of the barrel.
Okay.
It is gas-operated, and that's what cycles the rifle. When you break it all down, it's still just a semi-automatic rifle like many other rifles that people may be more familiar with, even going back to the Ruger Mini 14, which is a very similar rifle. However, it typically has a wooden stock, does not have a pistol grip, and that sort of thing. However, functionally, they're about the same.
So now, there is an extraordinarily large differential between the AR-15 and the utilization of that ammunition in connection with a regular hunting rifle. In fact, looking at some of your magazines that you brought for our audience today, you're looking at the magazine to the far left. That is considered a high-capacity magazine. Is that correct?
Correct. As it stands, all of these magazines will be considered high capacity in some states like California that limit you to 10 rounds per magazine. This magazine is a 40-round magazine for the AR-15. This magazine is a 30-round magazine for the AR-15. I would classify the 30-round magazine as a standard capacity. It's the magazine that was designed to fit in the firearm, and that's what's commonly used. These two are pistol magazines. Also, again, this one would be what I would consider a standard capacity.
Okay.
This is what's designed to be used in the gun. That's what fits in the grip. This one would be considered what I would consider high capacity.
Now, you talked about earlier the fact that the AR-15 can be used for sport, and I think you almost alluded to the fact that you could also use it for hunting.
You can use it for hunting. In fact, I know a lot of people that use it for hunting small game and varmint, all the way up to deer. You can chamber it in many different calibers, and so there are several calibers conducive for deer hunting and even somewhat larger game.
But you have to admit, the utilization of an AR-15 in a high-capacity magazine, it really doesn't seem to exude the idea of hunting big game. It seems to exude the idea of what the media currently portrays it as a weapon that's used to kill other people.
It is not your typical hunting rifle. That's correct.
So would you agree that the AR-15 essentially is made as a tactical weapon or as a weapon for personal protection?
I believe so. Yes, it is. It is a tactical firearm, and it's an excellent firearm for self-defense.
So now, when you look at the Second Amendment, the way it was crafted, in connection with the AR-15 and the use that we have it today, would you say that the Second Amendment envisioned the use of the AR-15?
I believe that the founders penned the Second Amendment the way it is for a reason, and they left it fairly open-ended, and they left it open for a reason to include any firearm that could possibly come into production. There's no way that they could have foreseen the AR-15 or the AK-47
Sure.
From the muskets that they were using at the time.
But don't you think that the Second Amendment in and of itself is a way that humanity, or Americans specifically, can justify the use of deadly force against other individuals?
I believe that the Second Amendment is merely the acknowledgement of a right that people, I believe, have at birth, and that's the right to defend themselves. So the use of deadly force, unfortunately, is a way to defend yourself if deadly force is being used on you. So the use of deadly force is not always something big and evil.
Right.
You know, if you are not doing anything wrong and somebody is trying to harm you, the use of deadly force is justified.
Well, I guess my thing is, let's assume for a second that the Second Amendment never passed. Let's assume for a second that it actually banned the use of assault weapons and that we don't have assault weapons ever again. Would you still say that you would have an inalienable right to defend yourself with a firearm?
I believe so, yes.
And why is that?
Because being a human being, everybody has the right to pursue their life and to live here on this planet. It's not just rights that are given to us in countries like the United States. I believe those rights are given to us at birth, some would say by God or by a creator, but all people, I believe, possess those rights at birth. Sometimes governments take those rights away and limit those rights, and so they, things like free speech and things like our Second Amendment don't always apply in other countries. But I do believe that we are born with them.
So what do you say to individuals who look at the AR-15 in connection with the Second Amendment and say the AR-15 is the reason why Sandy Hook, Columbine, the most recent incident in Dallas, the most recent incident now in Baton Rouge, all these incidents have occurred? What do you say to people that criticize the AR-15?
I'm glad you brought that up. There's a few points to touch on there. So going back as far as Columbine, which is one of kind of the first mass shootings in kind of recent history, the shooters in Columbine actually used firearms and magazines that were California compliant and limited to 10 rounds per magazine. They just brought much more of them. So they were using firearms that were in compliance with an assault weapon ban at the time. Sandy Hook obviously was a tragedy. I believe that any firearm could have been used for that, and any firearm would have had the same effect. I don't believe that the AR-15 exacerbated the tragedy, made it worse, made it a higher body count, and I believe that bad people are going to do bad things,
Sure,
regardless of what firearm they're using.
But the problem that I have is that the fact that we see a whole lot of bad people using this same styled weapon, whether it's a Bushmaster AR-15,
Right.
a Ruger 5.56, they're all based on that AR-15 platform.
Right.
And you have a lot of people in Washington who are diligently trying to ban not just the use of the AR-15, but the creation of any further AR-15s. Why shouldn't they keep up their efforts?
I don't believe that banning the AR-15 will actually impact violent crime as a whole. Most of the time when we hear about these mass shootings, everybody gets upset, and they're tragic to hear about. The truth is that most people that are killed by a firearm are not killed in a mass shooting. Most firearm-related deaths are still attributed to things like gang violence.
Drunk driving.
Well, that's as far as firearm deaths go. That's different, but yeah, there are not a lot of people every year that get killed by a firearm as a whole. And then when we talk about mass shootings, it's far fewer. So, murder is going to happen whether there are firearms available or not, whether they have high capacity magazines or large magazines or an AR-15. People are still going to perpetrate evil onto other people, and those things are still going to happen.
And we'll be right back with Michael O'Donnell with Sasquatch Mountain Tactical.
For the record, proof to show the truth.
And we're back with Michael O'Donnell with Sasquatch Mountain Tactical. Michael, again, thank you for coming. One thing I'd like to look at is looking specifically at the Second Amendment, the first couple words that talk about a well-regulated militia. It specifically says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. And then it ends with a comma. Correct. How do you look at the first portion of the Second Amendment in light of that statement?
I believe it makes it pretty clear that the Second Amendment applies to being able to protect yourself, right? It says being necessary to a free state.
Right.
So the Second Amendment is specifically designed to keep your freedom.
But it's talking about specifically a militia. It's talking about the regulation of a militia. And what's concerning to me when you look across this country, people look to the word regulated as some way to regulate your right to carry a firearm. But if you look at it in connection to the actual statement in the Second Amendment, it says a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state.
I believe that a well-regulated militia could mean many things. It could be your family, for instance. You guys are organized, you have firearms, and you're capable of protecting yourself. As far as a militia goes, I don't believe it needs to be a group of men with uniforms that get together regularly. It could just be the average citizens.
Right.
And at the time of, say, if a foreign invasion happens, if a foreign force tried to invade the United States, then those citizens would now kind of be called into action, and that militia would now be formed, and they would be there to repel that force or to repel whatever invasion. Or if the government were to try to if the government became tyrannical and started to take other rights away or do things that the government is not allowed to do, now the citizens can organize to repel its own government and to basically, stop the government from doing things it's not allowed to do.
So do you see anything in this first portion of the amendment when it talks about a regulated militia? Do you see any of that language lending itself to the regulation of somebody to carry a firearm? And I know here in Minnesota we talk about a permit to carry a pistol.
Correct.
Do you think, from your perspective, especially being in that tactical background, that there's some correlation between the Second Amendment, the word regulation or regulated, and the government being able to regulate your ability to carry a firearm?
I don't believe that there's anything mentioned in the Second Amendment about carrying a firearm. I believe that you should be allowed to carry a firearm. I also don't believe that the government should restrict that from you. In places like California, Chicago, New York, it's very hard to get a permit to carry a firearm. It's almost impossible.
Right.
And so it's not much of a right if you have to get a license and permission to exercise that right and pay an exorbitant amount of money to be able to get a California carry permit, for instance. I do believe that every citizen, as long as they are not a prohibited person like a felon or somebody who's mentally ill, they should be allowed to carry a firearm in public in order to protect themselves.
And that kind of lends itself to this next conversation, which is when you look at the attempts to restrict or regulate the ability to carry a pistol, you do have regulations, for example, that ban certain individuals that are convicted of certain crimes from being able to possess not just firearms, but ammunition and explosives. Do you think that the government should be able or be allowed to do something like that when you yourself mentioned earlier that people should have an inalienable right to have and possess a firearm?
That's kind of a gray area, and that's a tricky subject because I don't believe that criminals should be allowed to walk around with guns.
Sure.
Because that is potentially dangerous to law-abiding citizens. However, I do believe that if you are convicted of a crime and you've done your time, there are people who can show that they have changed and that they've bettered themselves. And also, we need to look at when your jail sentence is up, you have served your time, as they say. And so...
Paid your debt to society, so to speak.
Correct, and that was the punishment. But now, as a felon, you are no longer allowed to have a firearm for the rest of your life.
Or vote.
Or
do a number of other basic things.
Right, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I'm not saying that it's a good idea to give all felons those rights back, but I think that there should be a better and an easier way for certain people to prove that they are now somebody who can be trusted to own firearms and to get those rights back. And I do know people who have had a felony on their record, and after a certain amount of years it dropped to a lesser misdemeanor and they got their rights restored. That's not very common, I don't believe, but I do know people where that's happened.
You know, looking kind of forward, or actually in this case backwards to a lot of these mass shootings, most people involved in these things are dealing with some type of mental illness.
Right.
It doesn't seem like it's all that difficult to get access to an AR-15, whether legally or illegally. How do you regulate, or how would you suggest there be any regulation as it relates to regulating against people that have mental illness or disease from getting access to firearms?
Well, if you were to buy it legally through through a gun shop that's got an FFL, which stands for Federal Firearms License, you do have to go through a background check. You have to answer some questions, and one of the questions is if you've been, mentally adjudicated, and so
or adjudicated mentally ill or mentally
correct.
deficient. Okay.
And so those questions are on there. Also, it is up to the gun shop itself. If they don't feel comfortable selling you a firearm, they have the right to refuse to sell it to you.
You ever heard of a situation like that where somebody who's about to get $1,500 to $4,500 feels like they shouldn't sell you a firearm?
I heard about a reporter who tried to buy a firearm, and in his state he had to wait several days, I believe, to get it. And the gun shop found out that he had wrote articles about spousal abuse and having a history of alcoholism, and also suicidal thoughts, I believe. And they refused to sell him the firearm. I don't think that's commonplace, but I do think there are probably far more instances where people say, I'm not really comfortable selling this person a gun, and it never makes it to the news. We don't hear about it.
Right.
They just say, no, we don't think we're going to sell you that gun today. And it's possible that person goes to another gun shop and buys it. But those things are all in place, right? There is a background check, and it's a pretty good one. And so there are times that you can fill out the paperwork, do the background check, and they decide that they're going to take a little bit of extra time, and they tell you to come back in a couple of days.
Right.
So I've had it happen to myself before, and so it does happen.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, this is all extremely intriguing, especially to our viewers who look at the Second Amendment and kind of take the word of their politicians that there's some form of regulation built into the Second Amendment as it relates to individual rights and completely gloss over the militia aspect of it. But let me turn our attention to another aspect, which is the permit to carry a firearm.
Okay.
And I know in every state's a little bit different. Here where we're at now in Minnesota, people consistently refer to a permit to carry a pistol as a permit to conceal a weapon.
Right.
Now, is there a distinction between those two concepts?
In Minnesota, there's not. In other states, there are. In Minnesota, for example, the firearm carry permit is the same whether it's concealed or open carried, where it's exposed. Some states you are allowed to open carry with it exposed without a permit, and if you want to conceal it, then you have to have a permit. Some states only allow you to have a permit to conceal it, and it must be concealed. Minnesota, you are allowed to carry concealed or openly.
Right.
The permit is the same, and there's no distinction between the two. You're not obligated to conceal it. It is your decision ultimately.
And there's actually a distinction between a permit to purchase a firearm and a purchase to possess a firearm or to walk around with it open or concealed.
Right.
What's the distinction between the two?
A permit to purchase would be something you would go to your local police station and you'd tell them, I want to apply for my permit to purchase, and it is a permit to buy firearms and then what's commonly referred to as assault weapons.
Those are your
like
AR-15,
the AR-15.
AK-47
You need
type
a
things.
permit to purchase that. It is a free permit and it takes 7 days. You would fill out the paperwork and submit it to your local police station, and they will do the background check and decide on whether or not they're going to issue that. In Minnesota, that is good for 1 year. If you have your carry permit, however, your carry permit acts as your permit to purchase, and that is good for 5 years.
So then the distinction is if you have a permit to carry, you can also use that to purchase.
Correct.
But if you have a permit to purchase, you cannot carry.
Correct.
And there are also some statutory distinctions in that if you have a permit to purchase, you can have your firearm in your vehicle for transportation purposes. But if you have your permit to carry, you basically have unfettered access and can walk around with it so long as you don't meet certain criteria of alcohol or intoxication, or again, being in violation as a prohibited person, things of that nature.
And there are areas where you're not allowed to take it, like hospitals, government buildings, schools, places of that nature. Your carry permit only pertains to handguns, so it doesn't pertain to long guns like rifles, shotguns, things of that nature. So if you were to transport one of those, they still have to be in the trunk of your vehicle and unloaded, that kind of thing, in a case or a bag that covers the whole firearm.
And that's kind of where the distinction with the AR-15 comes into place, because although it appears to be a long gun, it's still regulated as though it's a handgun. Is that correct?
Yes, it's kind of there's a little weird kind of space there where you need a permit to purchase it, even though there are similar firearms that functionally are the same. They may be aesthetically a little bit different, but functionally they do the same thing. They take similar magazines.
Sure.
They have a similar rate of fire and that nature, and you do not need a permit to purchase those.
We'll be right back with Michael O'Donnell with Sasquatch Mountain Tactical in just a moment.
For the record, proof to show the truth.
Well, Michael, thank you for coming on the
Thanks,
show.
Ben.
We do appreciate that. And this is Ben Myers with Ask for TR. You're not alone.